The American people I want lower drug costs. I mean, I look at EpiPen and how we got ripped off. My wife used to use an EpiPen. She didn't have to have it, but when it went from 100 or 175 to 600, and the CEO was making bazillions, and the chairman of the board made even more, and there was no competition, we said BS on it. And guess what? We rewrote the law on the FDA approval process for medical devices in the last Congress that said if there's no competitor to a generic, you go to the head of the line if you've got competition. Guess what? We now have a competitor to EpiPen. All right? So they want to put us in this political box. Oh, we're for high drug costs. That is total BS.
So you're saying this is all about 2020?
I'm saying this is all about 2020. And it didn't have to be this way. Does anybody, the Senate's already said they're not taking up this bill. You know, we passed Purple Book.
So this is an exercise in futility.
This is an exercise in partisan politics. And the American people will suffer as a result. If you want to do something about drug prices, we're all in. But we're not going to be all in if we know that it's going to result in less innovation. No industry invests more in R&D than the pharmaceutical biosimilar industry.
Does it have to result in less innovation? Can there be savings?
No, it doesn't have to result.
Elsewhere?
Yes, of course.
They say, what is it, 40 cents out of every dollar that's spent on a pharmaceutical doesn't go to the pharmaceutical companies. It goes to the middlemen, to the PBMs, to the wholesalers. I mean, I know
absolutely.
The president was trying to take that on. Can we take another whack
There
at
is
that?
so much we can do in this space. I mean, if I'd stayed on as chairman, the high cost of health care would have been our agenda. And it would have been more than just picking on one industry, right? I mean, I was on a hospital board. I owned my own business. We paid 100% of the insurance for premiums for the people who work for us. I've been on every side of this table. And I'll tell you what I've learned of late. Look at what we're doing on surprise medical billing. Frank Pallone and I are joined at the shoulder, hip, and ankle on this deal. And the private equity firms and others are spending $60 million attacking what we're trying to do. They're buying practices, taking them out of network, increasing the billable charges by 96%. And 1 out of 5 people when they go to an emergency room in America now are getting stuck with a surprise bill. This is how you bring... And turn off the mic. This is how... Wow. I didn't know Pelosi had control of that. But there are things we can do here to make healthcare more affordable. I'm not a big fan of the International Price Index. Mm-hmm. Now, I know the president's put that out there as an idea. Right. They're floating it around. I actually have an amendment that says, fine, then let's apply it to all healthcare. Because guess what? Drugs are expensive, yes. Mm-hmm. You want to compare international, you want to bring costs down and socialize our healthcare system, starting with drugs? What's it cost to go to a hospital in Europe? What's a doctor get paid in Europe, or what do they charge? So if you want to have this debate, let's have the global debate here about the whole thing. Why are our deductibles so high in health insurance, and why don't they cover these drugs? We should be having the insurance companies in to answer that. I mean, I've got a colleague who I think will say today her daughter's going off her insurance. She's type 1 diabetic. Her insulin is not covered by her employer's insurance.
Incredible.
How does that happen? So see, my point is, there is so much we could do here. We went after the EpiPen scandal, and we dealt with it in a bipartisan way, and that is now law. We went after cures.
Are there any options? Are there any other options? Say, what about Grassley-Wyden?
Well, they have to. There are some interesting principles there. In fact, we will take some of those in some of our amendments today. And there's things we could work out, probably with Grassley-Wyden. I know the White House has been working closely with both of them. They're both serious legislators. There's things we could get done. But they have to get their bill. I don't know if it's fully written yet. You know, the Senate Finance Committee does this thing where they mark up in rainbows and butterflies and theories, and then they actually write the language.
Is that how it works?
That is how it works. Yeah, they mark. You all know this. They mark up in sort of concepts, and then the actual wording gets done later. It's the only committee that does that. And they had a very tight vote even getting the bill passed initially. So, I mean, there's a long process in the Senate before we see what. I think several Republicans said they voted out at committee, but it would require substantial changes. So it's still in flux over there. But what I do know is this bill will be a partisan bill. And a bunch of Democrats wrote to the Speaker of the House recently and said, please don't do this. Let's do bipartisan work here on drug pricing. But today will, unfortunately and sadly, not be that day, and the American people will not see progress.
Congressman, before we may have time for one or two questions. I wanted to ask you, do you think, considering what the House has on its plate right now, the impeachment inquiry, that anything will be passing of any consequence, whether it's prescription drug pricing measures or anything else that would really
I'm not
of
very
consequence?
optimistic watching what's happening. I've been around a while. As people know, you watch these sort of storms build, and it gets in the way of progress and policy. I mean, our surprise medical billing legislation, we passed it in July out of committee, the floor yet. We're working on it. I think there's a deal to be had there, but it hasn't moved yet. You know, we've got a bunch of things. I was with my community health centers last week in my district. They're saying, when are you going to do the reauthorization of funding? I'd like to see 4 or 5 years. I think there's agreement to do that, but it hasn't moved yet. There are a bunch of these extenders that are running out. How do you hire people if you don't know what your budget's going to be next year that need to get done? And so it just feels like everything's getting bollocksed up, and we're out 2 weeks in October, 2 weeks in November. We don't know the December schedule yet. Some of this has to be done by year end. We don't have any appropriation bills done yet. I mean, yeah, it's kind of a train wreck, if you want to know the truth. But I get back to my point. There's a lot we could be doing here. We are fully committed to bringing down the price of drugs in a way that doesn't spike innovation or deter investment in it, because I think that'll be if the Pelosi bill were to become law, I think you'd see a shifting of investment. You'll have certified smart investor folks, I think, later talking about their views on this. But we don't need another sleeping pill. We don't need another ED drug. You know, we don't need the one-offs that make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. We need to find cures to something like Alzheimer's that every 65 seconds somebody's diagnosed with. It's going to cost us trillions in the future.
Well, let's take a quick question from the audience. And if you would, stand up and identify yourself. And let's see. We have
They do have coffee in the back. We've put you fully to sleep.
All right. Well, Congressman, I guess it's going to be up to me then. So,
wow.
What is your hope then as we look forward?
Well, my hope
shows the most promise?
Yeah, my hope is we get this out of our system. Mm-hmm. I know they have to go move this bill and get it done, and then we can get back to real legislating and tackle the American people's problems. That's what they send us here for. They know we have differences of opinion and philosophy, but they really do expect us to put down the political swords and do big things. We're capable of doing big things, and the energy and commerce under Republican and Democrat leadership has done big things. And so I remain, believe it or not, optimistic we can if they're allowed to, because I know Frank Pallone well and Anna Eshoo and others, and they're serious legislators. They want to get things done, and they'll back this bill. But in their heart of hearts, they got to know it's dead on arrival in the Senate.
And is it the Medicare, the negotiating, is that the poison pill? I mean, it works for the VA, works for Medicaid.
So let's talk about the VA.
Wonder why, and we
right.
Why
so
it wouldn't work here.
So interestingly enough, you have about 7 million people in the VA system. They have a very strict formulary, and they actually have escape hatches in that formulary, so that if you want a drug that's not in the formulary, there's an appeals process you go through. This bill does not have that. So if you're a veteran and you're locked in a tight formulary, and it's pretty much it isn't the blockbuster drugs that are in there, I'm told, although some probably are. Your physician says you need this drug, it's not in the formulary, there's a way to go outside the formulary. This bill does not give the rest of us that opportunity. When we passed Medicare Part D, remember the Democrats fought us tooth and nail. They wanted to lock the premium in statute, which would have made it significantly higher now than it would otherwise be. They didn't believe in market forces, and they wanted the government to negotiate. But let's talk about this negotiation in H.R. 3 for a second. So what it says is you're going to have 120%, you can go up to 120% of the International Price Index. And then the secretary can come in anywhere under that. So you just invented a drug, and you're selling it elsewhere. And if I understand the way this works, I'm the secretary, and I say, that's great, you're selling it for $120 in England. I'm only going to pay you $50. And you go, I'm not going to do that. Yeah, you are. No, I'm not. Yeah, you are. No, I'm not. Okay, you're not? Okay. Then I'm going to start assessing your revenues 65%. And within 3 years, I'm going to get it to 95%. That's what's called negotiation, Soviet-style, government-run HR3 Pelosi. You think that's negotiation?
Well,
I don't.
amendments could change that, couldn't they?
Well, a lot could change that. But the long and the short of it is what you're going to do, and then inflation caps, we believe are going to drive higher entry into market pricing. Because if you know you're capped forever, you're going to launch that drug at a much higher price. And some of that's going on today, and we need to be looking at that. But I think this will only exacerbate that, because if I only get one shot to launch the drug, which I will, and after that I'm locked at inflation, I'm going to do probably two things: launch high, and I'm going to raise every other drug price to the inflationary cap, because I'm limited on these other ones where I really make my money. So I think you're going to see actual price increases in the others. And then I think you're going to see one-offs that don't really do much for humanity, but do inflate the wallet of those who make them. And if you're a rare disease, you look at this challenge we're having with a basic childhood cancer drug that children are no longer able to get.
And Christine, right.
That Teva quit making, I think it's Teva quit making, or Teva, and Pfizer's trying to catch up on right now. What happens if Pfizer says, we're done with this too, government? We're losing money on it, and under this negotiated thing, we're out of here too. Who makes it next? And don't you think some of that we ought to think through before we ram through a bill that's had one hearing and one subcommittee with one opposing witness, basically? Because we all want to get drug prices down.
It's a lot to think about. Congressman, thank you so much.
Yep, thanks for being.
Really
Thanks for letting me be here.
Thank you.
And now, for a conversation about modernizing the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, please welcome Dr. Amy Abernathy, the FDA's Principal Deputy Commissioner and Acting Chief Information Officer. Here to lead the conversation is journalist Susan Salney.
Good morning again, and thank you for being here for this discussion about the future of the FDA, where there's an enormous push underway right now to modernize and create a more efficient and streamlined agency.
Yes.
And you have your hands full because that is a big job. But it seems like your background is particularly suited to this moment because in addition to being an MD, PhD, your expertise has been in health tech and real-world data. Can you tell us what that means as a medical term?
Sure. So I've always been focused on this fundamental question, how can we learn from the care of all people that have been similar to this patient sitting in front of me, and how can we reinvest the story that's unfolding in front of me and this patient into the story in the future. And fundamentally, real-world data and real-world evidence is information that's already being generated in the real care that we're providing every day. Sometimes it's in the electronic health record, sometimes it's in claims, sometimes it's information that represents the past, and sometimes we're intentionally collecting it from the future. But this is information that is already being generated in the day-to-day practice of care that we can now make sense of, clean up, curate, generate at high enough quality that we can rely on it to understand in a credible way what works and what doesn't for a patient.
And this is something that had not been optimized in the past?
I'm a clinical researcher by background as well as an oncologist, and I can say that we've had observational studies and intentional collection of information through registries and other ways for a very long time. But the world of real-world data and real-world evidence has become possible really because of technology and what's in front of us from a technical and data perspective in 2019 and forward. Practically speaking, we've got better digital technology in the clinic, including electronic health records. We've got the ability to use sophisticated software and also analytic expertise to get data cleaned up and to be of really high quality. And we've also got now many more sophisticated analytic methods that allow us to make sense of it in a way that tells us with much more confidence that indeed this drug or medical device or other medical product is making a difference or not.
And how are you able to apply that expertise at the FDA?
So it's interesting. What I learned as a physician in the clinic and as a person in the health tech industry before coming to the FDA was that, in fact, we are sitting in a revolution in medicine that allows us to make use of technology, and technology that also allows us to make use of data in really important ways all across biomedicine. And as I look to the role of FDA in biomedicine, as FDA, we're responsible for promoting and protecting public health and making sure that medical products that we're using in care every day are adequately safe and effective. And we can use data and technology to make that process of understanding what's safe and effective much more efficient.
Now, there is a specific plan underway right now. It's called the Technology Modernization Action Plan. So I want to talk some specifics about the plan. The document I read said the plan is to address a, quote, large and persistent gap that separates important scientific advances from new ways to protect public health. And because of this gap, millions of Americans are not feeling the promise of amazing biomedical advances in their day-to-day lives. So how does this plan close that gap?
So practically speaking, when I came to the FDA, what I thought was going to happen was that I was going to bring my expertise as a data person to help to close that gap by allowing us to use data much more efficiently at FDA. And what I learned was that there's a huge appetite at FDA to use data much more efficiently, whether that is to use data more efficiently in the regulatory review process or use data and technology much more efficiently to, for example, help conduct more efficient clinical trials. But practically speaking, there was an early step that was missing. And so the Technology Modernization Action Plan actually is intended to solve for this early step around technology, and I'll tell you more about what it is, so that then we are prepared and capable of using data in the ways that inside the agency and across biomedicine we want to do. So what do I mean by that? Practically speaking, using data means first you have to have a foundation of computer technology and software that allows you to store and make sense of and organize information and data and be able to retrieve it and exchange it in very facile ways. We do this every day on our, smartphone or even how we interface with the internet. But in fact, the way the agency has been organized technically since the 1990s isn't really prepared for that kind of cloud infrastructure forward way of using and exchanging data.
Really? So we're talking about hardware and software?
Some of this is good old-fashioned hardware and software. But, you got to make sure you've got the foundations right. So the Technology Modernization Action Plan says three critical things. The first is that we are going to focus on making sure our technical infrastructure is adequately secure, cloud forward, and ready for data exchange for now and into the future. The second thing it says is that we're going to enable a series of living examples, use cases, that showcase inside the agency and across biomedicine what's possible today, as well as envision the future and allow all of us to start building towards that future. And I can give you some examples of use cases in a minute if you like. And the third thing it says is that as an agency, we're going to do something that we really haven't done systematically before. Mm-hmm. And that's learn how to communicate and collaborate with the larger community of data and technology innovators so that we can make sure that they know how to work with us, they know the problems to be solved, and also when they're building regulated products, they have an easy way to understand what is regulated. And when they're building products that fit into our industry, for example, life sciences or biopharma, they understand what the FDA has got to say in this space so that they can build the kind of products that we need across biopharma in a smart way.
So better communication with the technology industry.
Yeah, so that's something that we haven't really done in a systematic way before.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. So what's the timeline for this plan?
So the timeline for the plan, and as I alluded to, the plan itself is intended to be a foundational book of work that then gets us ready for the future. And so this foundational book of work is really for the next 18 to 24 months. Mm-hmm. And I anticipate that really as the plan gets underway, you're going to see us also then start talking about how does this book of work also get us ready to start to use data in smarter ways inside the agency and in the future. And I think that will probably start to unfold in the next 12 months or so too.
Exciting. Well, let's talk big picture for a moment and tap into our theme for today, which is innovation and access. How would a more modern and updated FDA balance medical innovation with access? That's saying Americans want better and less expensive healthcare.
So practically speaking, one of the things I think that's interesting about this story of innovation and access is a common denominator across both of these sides of the equation is data and technology. So practically speaking, if we want to speed up innovation, we ultimately and actually have more solutions available to us, right? We ultimately need to make the process of developing them as well works and what doesn't work. But we need to make that process more efficient. And so my expectation is that better data and technology is going to help to make that more efficient. How? So some of it is about the process of, for example, clinical development and understanding medical product effectiveness. So that's essentially things like getting the right patients into clinical trials quickly, being able to have smarter and more agile clinical trial solutions such as platform clinical trials, being able to use real-world evidence in confident ways as a part of the clinical evidence development process. Also, speeding up that process is going to be inside the agency. So allowing medical reviewers inside the agency to more efficiently look for safety signals or use data sets to understand how medical products are performing. That's on the innovation side. So I see all of these things as helping us have more innovation in the market. And then on the access side, part of the access story is being able to understand differences in not only in how medical products are working, but how medical products are working across populations, et cetera. Most of which, again, requires us to have better data about medical products, including their outcomes and their cost effectiveness outcomes.
Right. Well, just a reminder to the audience that I'll be coming for your questions in just a moment, so have them ready. Some topics in the news right now, drug shortages and prices. The New York Times had a piece this week about an older, inexpensive drug off patent for decades that's in short supply to treat children with cancer. What is the FDA's role here? I heard that there's a task force looking into this issue.
Yeah, so, I'm an oncologist by background. I think I mentioned that. The drug that's been talked about this week is vincristine, and this is a drug that is an old drug, as you indicated, that is part of the group of drugs that we use to treat childhood leukemia, and in fact is a part of the treatment group that is a part of the cure for this disease. So it's an important drug. And I think, as you just heard in the last conversation with Senator Walden, ultimately this drug is now not being made by one company, and then another company is stepping up to the plate to start manufacturing this drug. And as FDA, as these stories unfold, we intentionally work with manufacturers to try and help them get the drug manufactured and the supply ready quickly. But that's not all we're doing is, one-off scenarios. We have an entire staff at the agency focused on this particular topic. And we're constantly working with manufacturers to try and predict where drug shortages might be and how we can ultimately help to relieve those shortages. And one of the numbers that I heard recently that really sort of gave me pause. In 2018, we had a little north of 50 drug shortages in this country.
Oh.
But more importantly, or equally as importantly, I'd say, 50 is still a lot, but equally as importantly, we had north of 160 that the FDA helped to alleviate before they occurred by thinking with the manufacturers about how can we go after and solve for these drug shortages.
Does this tap into the importance of generic competition in the marketplace?
So I think it taps into the importance of generic competition and making sure that we have a successful marketplace where drugs and innovators can come in and actually be able to compete, but it also taps into the criticality of making sure that drugs can be manufactured as efficiently as possible.
Another topic in the news right now, vaping. So so-called vaping illness has sickened 1,000 people across the country. 18 have died. Some critics say the FDA dropped the ball here in not alerting the public to the health consequences of vaping earlier enough. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think this is a story that is distressing to me as a mother. It's distressing to me as a regulator. It's distressing to me as an oncologist. And I think it's something that distresses all of us. Practically speaking, this is also a story that is playing out in front of us and speaks to the complexity of regulating products like vaping. So certainly as we're trying to understand this better, what we're seeing is that a lot of this is related to parts of the story that we don't specifically regulate, such as THC, but also at the end of the day, how the regulations played out across time. As the agency, we're committed to getting out a policy soon that really takes non-nicotine flavored products out of the market. But importantly, we're also committed and have been working incredibly quickly basically 24 hours a day in many ways to try and understand what is causing the current vaping crisis and how to actually start to solve for that.
Okay. Well, I promised the audience some time. Is there anyone? I have a question right here in the front.
Okay, thanks. Hi, my name is Ace Robinson. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the National Minority AIDS Council, so thank you for being here. So I have a question related to what can we do and what are the federal partners that you need to work with in order to increase to decrease medical mistrust, pharmaceutical distrust, and clinic distrust when it comes to new types of drugs that are coming onto market. Case in point, the injectable HIV treatment that is coming to market hopefully by the end of the year. When we're looking at, it's not going to be just about the access piece that you were speaking to, but trying to prepare the community for new utilization of a new type of indication that will really help drive down HIV transmissions through, of course, making sure we have people who are adherent to medication and able to reach viral suppression. So case in point, like how are we going to partner with you to ensure that we have services that are available that meet the needs of community, whether they're rural, whether they live in healthcare deserts, whether there is the demographic medical mistrust.
So really important topic, which is really how do we engender trust, right? And what are the solutions that we can put into place right now, and then where does this go in the future? As the agency, we've been thinking a lot about this and trying to take action, but I think one of the things that you just pointed out is it's not just within the agency, it's actually all across the community, and how do we have a series of partnerships and handshakes. A couple of practical examples. As we look at clinical trials and clinical trial designs, we need to make sure that those designs intentionally include wide populations, as well as then studies that happen after the approval trials that also continue to teach us how do medical products meet the needs across multiple different populations. So I think it's one example. Another is the agency has invested in, for example, developing labels. In the naloxone story, we actually did the development of labels to communicate effectively with patients in order to help improve the efficiency of getting naloxone out into communities. And so really trying to make sure how do we most confidently communicate in many different ways. And I think these are the kinds of things we need to keep doing together, and we also need to hear what are the solutions that need to be brought to the table.
Okay, I see another question there.
David Rhines, American College of Surgeons Health Policy. We just heard from the representative that if indeed we pass a Medicare bill that would, H.R. 3, that it will really hurt innovation. A lot of our drugs that I deal with, I notice, have been developed outside of the United States partially, and then are tested partially outside the United States. What's the FDA feel about using drugs that are made in Canada, made in Germany? Is there a way that you could oversee the quality of those drugs, which are, when I go to Canada, when I go to Vermont, I go across the border and buy drugs at 1/5 the price I get them here. In Germany, about 1/3. Is the FDA going to be able to, or have any desire to work internationally?
So internationally, and a couple of comments about this. So first of all, as drugs are developed and studied, as Americans, we certainly celebrate American innovation, but as FDA, we don't exclude drugs and biologics that have been developed in labs outside of the United States. So certainly international innovation is as critical to the American public as drugs that are specifically discovered here in our country. As those drugs get studied, we need to make sure that the studies that are conducted provide adequate evidence for safety and efficacy for the American public. And so we look at those studies from that lens. As drugs get approved, we need to make sure that then when they're manufactured, they're meeting American manufacturing standards. And so if they're being manufactured overseas, we have a very large workforce that is employed by FDA that goes out and inspects manufacturing facilities all across the world. As those drugs come into the country, we need to make sure that they come into the country, are consistently labeled, and have continued to meet our manufacturing standards. So we need to, again, monitor for that. And ultimately, if we're going to, for example, import drugs, we need to make sure that anything that's going to happen continues to meet our expectations as Americans, that they're appropriately labeled, that they're safe for us to use, and they meet the need at hand. And FDA is going to continue to focus in that way.
Okay, one more. I think we have time for one more.
Hi, I'm Mike Miller. I'm a physician and health policy advisor for Healthy Women. And thank you for bringing up the vaping. We wrote a blog in August, I think it was, about the vaping situation, sort of as it was exploding. A question I want to ask you, you can evade it if you want because it may be a little unfair, but I think it was yesterday, the day before, in Michigan, there was a court case that determined that the economic consequences of a ban or a restriction on selling vaping products in the state was outweighed by the economic consequence. So basically the judge said, well, the economic consequences of this ban, I'm going to say that's the right thing, whereas the public health emergency is not. From the FDA's perspective, I mean, there are reasons why there are public health emergency laws. I mean, if it's for swine flu or bird flu, you know, if a judge were to say, well, the pork producers or the chicken farmers, their economic interests outweigh this public health emergency, as a physician, as a public health person, I would be very worried. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that, what happened in Michigan, or sort of the general balance between economic interest and public health emergencies?
So as FDA, and you've just pointed out, our responsibility is to protect and promote public health, full stop. We also have as a focus to also promote innovation, but public health is our first responsibility. And, you know, I think that we couldn't have envisioned the vaping story as it played out completely, although certainly as we saw more and more youth using vaping products, that was a big signal that we had to continue to pay attention in progressively more intentional ways. I think your point about this balance between essentially the market forces versus the public health forces is very important. And you know, as the person who is co-leading the CBD working group at the agency, I continue to think about it in that vein as well, where we really need to think about what is happening to try and basically develop a market for our farmers, for example, versus what do we need to do to try and make sure we protect American consumers, make sure they have adequate information about safety, make sure that we ultimately are having, again, manufacturing standards, labeling standards, that we know what products we should be buying off the shelves. And so as the agency, we're going to continue to focus on that all across the product spectrum.
Just one last thing. What is your most optimistic view of the future of the FDA?
So, you know, as I think about innovation in the future, one of the things that I find absolutely spectacular is the number of potential medical products coming down the pipeline that's going to improve all of our health, as well as the same on the food side too. The number of ways that innovative foods are going to continue to improve our health. That for me has been what drew me to the agency, and I think part of our responsibility right now is to make sure we have an agency prepared to be able to continue at a very efficient pace, reviewing and giving confident information to consumers. And so part of my excitement for the future is both what's coming as well as how to help make the agency be as efficient as possible to solve for it.
Deputy Commissioner, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Up next, to explore how to balance innovation with cost, please welcome Josh Seidman, Managing Director of Avalere Health, Rena Conti, Associate Research Director at Boston University's Institute for Health System Innovation and Policy, and Dr. Anand Parekh, Chief Medical Advisor at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Back to lead the conversation is Kathleen Koch.
Welcome, everyone. I think Anand and Rena, it's so interesting that at two separate events this year, you both used the same phrase, that we are living in unprecedented times when it comes to medical care in the United States. And Rena, you said because cures are coming faster than ever before. And Anand, you said because for the first time in 100 years, we've had 3 consecutive years of decreasing life expectancy. Now, I know a number of factors came into play, including the opioid crisis, but I really think that sets up our discussion today, and that is, how do we make sure that these extraordinary cures and innovations are accessible and are actually lengthening our lives and making us healthier? Anand, do you want to start?
Sure, and I want to thank Atlantic for organizing this very important forum. And I think, Kathleen, I think we have to do both. We have to be able to invest in innovation, at the same time expand health insurance coverage and ensure that Americans across the board have access to important therapies. And I guess the question is, what makes me confident that it is possible? I think it's important to look at sort of a recent paper in JAMA that looked at waste in American healthcare. Sure, we spent $3.6 or $0.7 or $0.8 trillion on healthcare in America, 18% of our gross domestic product. But it's estimated that 25 to 30% of those dollars don't go to improving health outcomes. Just imagine what we could do if we could redirect some of those resources, whether it's to other sectors of society, whether it's to pay down debt, or whether it's to invest in innovation to ensure that Americans get access to all the evidence-based health services that they need. So I do think it's possible in this country to do both invest in innovation as well as ensure that Americans have access to these therapies.
Rena and Josh, we started out the morning talking about prescription drug pricing. Would you like to share any thoughts? I didn't know if you had any comments on what the congressman said regarding H.R. 3 and the long-term and the short-term impacts, if that measure were to pass, but of course he says it's dead on arrival.
So it's clear that there's bipartisan support to improve the affordability of drugs in America, particularly for those who are underinsured or who are living on fixed incomes. So whether it's H.R. 3 or the Senate Finance Bill on drug reform, it's clear something will happen, or at least the stakeholders are very focused on addressing those issues. Whether or not the more controversial parts of the bill, which include both inflation penalties but also negotiation for drug pricing directly between the government and pharmaceutical companies, becomes a reality, we'll see. But certainly addressing affordability for fixed income, for seniors and other folks living on fixed income, has to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that right now there's such momentum from a public debate standpoint that there's going to be something that's going to continue to be a high priority. We know that about 40% of people are skipping treatments of some sort because of the cost of care, and so that's obviously high on the minds of people right now. How that translates into something getting done in the current political environment, I think, is another question.
Josh, I wanted to stay with you because one of the measures in H.R. 3 is using an international price index. And some critics of it say that can end up having this sort of circular effect where countries are looking at what other countries are doing instead of really looking at the cost. Basing it on concrete measures, basing the cost of the drug on the concrete measures of the medicine's clinical value or the cost of developing it and producing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to get to a point where we are basing costs of care on the benefits that they produce and getting to true value. We're obviously changing how we think about payment in general from a fee-for-service to more of a value-based payment environment. In that context, what the value of these various treatments are, and in doing so, we have to get to something that's based on the best evidence we have. Now, I will say that one of the challenges is that in some cases, the evidence that's being used is based on not sort of the full range of information that we have. So we need to think about more creative ways of understanding evidence, thinking about the use of real-world evidence, collecting data across what's going on in real-world settings, making the most of information systems and sharing that information that we can to get better information to answer those questions.
Anand, can you help us understand what some of the cost drivers are? So we're looking at affordability and access. I mean, you, obviously you're an internal medicine physician. You served in the Obama administration. So you've really seen this at HHS. You've seen this from both the public and the private policy side. So what are your thoughts on what the drivers are and how we can improve access?
Yeah, sure. So when you think of access costs or waste, you think about administrative complexity in healthcare in this country. You think about fraud and abuse. You think about pricing failures. You think about failures of care delivery, care coordination, overtreatment. There are many areas where there are access costs, I think, in our system. If I can piggyback on Josh's comments sort of about this important term value, I think how we incentivize innovation to address some of these issues are critical as well. So in this country, we prioritize safety and efficacy as we should. We have a regulatory pathway through FDA. We prioritize reasonable and necessary. We have a regulatory pathway for CMS, public payers, and private payers. What we don't have is what is happening in clinical settings every single day. Right now, thousands of patients and clinicians right now are having a conversation where there are FDA-approved treatments for a particular illness. They're paid for by an insurance company, but the clinician and the patient don't know which treatment is better than another. And that means we need to invest in this country in health services research, patient-centered outcomes research, comparative effectiveness research. Frankly, reauthorization of PCORI is one of the most important things Congress can do this session. But we need to ensure that patients get the right treatment, that the right treatments go to the right patients at the right time. And we'll only be able to do that and allocate our resources appropriately if we can get that information in the hands of patients as well as clinicians for shared decision making. So I think that's sort of one strategy. And we need to incentivize that type of innovation in the same way we value safety and efficacy. We need to incentivize sort of comparability as well as effectiveness. And if we can do that, I think the innovations that will come through will be that much more promising and will be, I think, accessible for more Americans.
Why is that not happening right now?
Well, I think to a certain extent, there is information about that. There's public sources of funding for that information. There's private sources. Some of this is proprietary. Some of it's not transparent. In some cases, it's not in the best interest of an entity, right? If you're manufacturing a particular product and another product is better, that might not be the best thing for your bottom line. So there are inherent difficulties right now in ensuring this important information gets into the hands of clinicians and patients. We need to surmount those barriers. We need to invest in this area. That will help our whole innovation pipeline. Because we'll then be creating innovations that are really true innovations that can be accessed by patients.
You know, Marina, at the Institute for Health System Innovation and Policy, you gather together these teams of interdisciplinary experts, and you are working to study and shape U.S. health policy. What are you finding when it comes to better aligning the public sector and private sector to bring these breakthrough treatments to market, but then make them affordable to the payer and the patient?
Sure. So we have two ongoing activities at the Institute right now that are very exciting. And I like to think of them as being financing innovation. So the first is about incenting innovators to invest in therapies that we know have a great unmet need. Specifically anti-infectives, including antibiotics, that we really need more of, and that we are finding innovators not invest in because the economic incentives at this current place are not there. And so we have a full public-private partnership where we are pulling innovations into the anti-infective space. Secondly, I am leading a team in the state of Louisiana that is partnering with innovators, specifically Gilead, to essentially create a volume-based contract with the innovator to bring new drugs that treat and really cure hepatitis C to the population.
That's fascinating. It's like a subscription model, like Netflix or something, right?
Right. So the idea is that is really what Walmart does. So essentially, we are committing. The state is committing to finding and treating folks, and in exchange for a volume, a quantity guarantee, they are getting a very deep discount on the drugs. So
And a cap on what they spend, correct?
that's right.
Very exciting. Josh, you have been at Evelier working on something called the value frame. Here it is, the patient perspective value framework. Help us understand what that is and how it's making a difference.
Yeah, well, there are, in around 2015, there emerged many value frameworks, ICER and ASCO and others came out with these value frameworks, and it's as I was saying before, we need to be able to understand value in order to make sort of evidence-based decisions about what makes sense in a world of limited resources. I think what we have found is that we're not always taking into account value through the lens of the patient. And the idea here was to develop a framework that started with what really matters to patients and thinking about how to value treatments in that way. Now, we're not creating a framework that's going to, compete with ICER or something. What we're trying to do is create specific methodological and technical recommendations that can increase the patient orientation of frameworks like ICER. And so that is being used in a couple contexts. One is to make those specific technical recommendations, and the other is to really support what Anand was talking about related to shared decision making. So what we also know, one of the reasons that's not happening is that people are not having those conversations in a structured way. And so how do we use this kind of information to really guide patients as they kind of go through their care journeys, particularly when they are facing very serious health issues?
Anand, when it comes to incentivizing innovation, you've talked and increasing access. You talked about cracking down on waste. What about unfair practices like patent abuse? How important is that? And what other measures do you see that we could use to really incentivize innovation?
Well, I think we need to always incentivize innovation. At the same time, we need to ensure that while we incentivize innovation, that there are not abuses. And I think ultimately, whether you look at patents and evergreening and patent abuse and patent tickets, we need to make sure that at the end of the day, what we're not doing is stifling competition and just raising prices and then reducing sort of the accessibility and the affordability is what we want to see. So I think we need to be balanced in our approach, and I think we need to look holistically. I think in terms of sort of pushing forward sort of innovation in the pharmaceutical space, I think we need to continue advancing all of the innovative models out there. Irina's mentioned the subscription model. Josh has talked about value-based pricing strategies, indication-specific pricing. We'll have a paper, Kathleen, on Tuesday coming out of the Bipartisan Policy Center looking at pharmaceutical reference pricing. That's both internal reference pricing as well as external reference pricing, which is really the basis.
Explain to us what that means.
Yeah, sure. So external reference pricing, as you heard from Congressman Walden, is essentially using other countries' prices as a benchmark potentially for our prices in this country. That's the basis of President Trump's IPI proposal, as well as Speaker Pelosi's H.R. 3, an international pricing index is the backstop of the negotiation process. So we look at external reference pricing. Then we also look at internal reference pricing, which is essentially if we can determine drugs are therapeutically equivalent, probably ought to be paying the same amount for those drugs. If you have two drugs that are equivalent in terms of clinically from an outcomes perspective, and one is priced here and one's priced here, maybe there's something wrong and maybe there's something we can do. And so,
well, what could we do to bring that price down from the higher one?
So that there are lots of different strategies, and public and private payers have looked at these. Medicare used to use what's called the least costly alternative. So if you have essentially two drugs, same effectiveness from a therapeutic perspective, one priced here and one priced here, that maybe CMS ought to pay for the least costly alternative, LCA policy. There are lots of different ways, but it all depends on ensuring that you have a data and research infrastructure in this country that can ascertain and determine therapeutic equivalence in a way that all stakeholders can agree upon. And that gets back to the importance, again, of having patient-centered outcomes research and comparative effectiveness research, getting this information out there for patients and clinicians for shared decision-making, but also then policymakers can make the best decisions in terms of how do you increase access.
Rena and Josh, I see you nodding. Do you want to jump in?
No, I mean, I think that we need a lot more evidence regarding what is the value of these products and how should they be best used. And that includes both clinical benefits, but also other benefits, which include people being able to work and take care of their families while they're undergoing therapy. Right now, we know something about the clinical benefits, at least in the short term, but gee, we really want to know there's other benefits as well in order to choose the best option and really to use our resources as wisely as possible.
I think that there's another component to this. I agree with everything that Anand was saying, and Rena. I think that there's also a practical at the point of care issue, and we've been working with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for the last 4 years on trying to normalize cost of care conversations in the clinical setting. Because typically, or historically, doctors probably, you probably say, I didn't go to medical school to talk about cost with my patients. I'm trying to find the best clinical alternative for my patient. But we know, as I said before, that 40% of patients are forgoing treatments because because of the costs of care. And so we have to be sensitive to that. And that means that it does become the job of the clinician to be mindful of that, particularly for people who have increasing copays, deductibles, increasing financial burden, and financial responsibility. So trying to come up with, once there's sort of established that we should be having some of these conversations, coming up with the right tools to support that, then trying to figure out how to integrate that into the clinical workflow. And then the last piece of this, which is what we're working on right now with the foundation, is how do you measure that and hold providers accountable for having those conversations?
Anand, I wanted to circle back around and talk a little bit more about patents. The congressman mentioned that his committee, their committee, had passed some measures, including ending one that would have ended pay for delay. They didn't end up ever making it to the Senate and getting a vote. I mean, how concerning is it that measures like that could have made a difference didn't really get anywhere? And then when we talk about patent abuse, how concerned are we about what goes on in China every day with when our drug manufacturers go over our pharmaceutical companies to make their drugs there? And China says, well, sure, as long as you give us all your trade secrets, tell us how it's made. And they force this on them.
Well, I would say I think there are probably some low-hanging fruits, whether it's pay for delay or the CREATES Act, that many of us have been talking about for quite a while, where there is some bipartisan agreement, and you'll see elements of these provisions in many of the bills in the House and the Senate. And so if something actually does come to fruition in terms of policies to increase affordability and accessibility of drugs, I suspect you will see some of that, some of those low-hanging fruits cross the finish line. I think in terms of, again, patents more broadly, we need to do what we can to protect intellectual property. I think, but here the conversation is ensuring that the incentives and the rewards for innovation are commensurate with the value of that innovation as well, and ensuring that the rewards are really for the innovation and not just to stifle competition. And that's often a very difficult line, but I think it's an area that we're all learning a little bit more about, and I think policymakers are as well, and ensuring that we're getting that important balance correct.
Rena, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a win-win. It's clear that this is great for patients because more competition, lower costs, greater availability, and frankly, it frees up resources in our system to be used for the next great thing that actually is going to alter the trajectory of our lives. So I think we all recognize that that improving competition, regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, is a really good thing to do, and it really is not going to stifle innovation. In fact, it may even pull more innovation out there.
Josh, on the subject of value frameworks that, that we were discussing earlier, obviously, as important as they are, when they come out with their results, they can generate controversy. And ICER did this week. ICER, for those who don't know, being the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. And their report last week found that the prices of 7 top-selling pharmaceuticals in the United States that went up fairly dramatically in 2017 and 2018, they said the prices went up despite limited evidence that patients using them experienced a greater benefit. So how concerning is that?
Yeah, well, I think, again, it's getting back to ensuring that we are getting to sort of a full review of the evidence. And again, that evidence needs to, one, include the views of everybody affected by it. So particularly really understanding what are the sort of patient views of value and ensuring that we're measuring that. And then the second piece is ensuring that the data that we're using are coming from sort of the full range of sources. We need to be able to tap into, so when we're looking at evidence, we're looking at studies that have been published some time ago, and we know about the chain of events that leads to data getting into the published literature. There is a much broader array of evidence that we could be tapping into to really get to sort of full, up-to-date information related to that.
Rena, backstage we were discussing, as we're talking about access here, the situation that's come up, really coming to folks' understanding this week about the childhood cancer drug vincristine, where one of only 2 manufacturers, Teva, has stopped making it. And now physicians around the country are realizing they may not have this vital drug that they need to save the lives of millions of American children. So what are your thoughts on that? What are we doing to stop that from happening with more and more vital drugs?
Yeah, so 90% of all drugs that are consumed in the United States are generic. They're off patent. And the vast majority of those products are not made domestically. They're made in the international supply chain, largely in India and China. My work and many others have suggested that the supply chain is actually quite fragile. And that's because for many of these backbone therapies, there really is only one manufacturer, or maybe 2, that is actually supplying those products. So when quality problems happen, or there's unexpected environmental challenges, such as hurricanes or typhoons, our supply of these products can actually be quite interrupted or fragile or vulnerable. So what do? These type of quality problems or supply chain vulnerabilities have been emergent for at least the past 10 years. There are shortages of other very important backbone therapies that the system has learned to deal with over time. The FDA is well aware of this, and they have done a really great job. They have reduced barriers to entry and supply so that they make sure that products that can come to market do come to market to relieve potential shortages. They've also really worked with the manufacturers to make sure that when manufacturers are experiencing quality problems, they really work through them, and that doesn't really actually threaten supply. And then, frankly, there are new ideas out there about what else we could do, which might include shoring up some of the domestic supply of these products, or finding other partners that can manufacture these products at the same high quality standards and safety that we're used to.
Thanks, Rena. Well, let's go to our audience for questions now. Any questions from my terrific panel? And we have one right up here in the front. And if you would stand and identify yourself, here comes the mic.
Good morning. I'm Kim Zabarik with the Cancer Support Community, and addressing the concerns of having patient perspective included. To date, patient experience data is not required to be collected in clinical trials. Could you all speak to that and a path forward where the collection of patient experience data, including psychosocial, would be required?
Great question.
Yes, we need that information. So there are folks out there, they'll say, well, the state of the science of how we actually think about those measures still needs improvement. Sure, we're all learning how best to measure those things, but that should not be an excuse or a barrier to actually start collecting quality of life and other measures for folks with cancer who are undergoing clinical treatment and others as well.
Yeah, related to the Patient Perspective Value Framework Initiative that I mentioned, one of the things that we worked on over the 2018, early part of 2019, was a set of global recommendations related to how to increase the patient orientation of existing value frameworks, something that we worked on with some other value framework developers, including the American Society of Clinical Oncology and the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. That work we published on our website. It's available, these global recommendations, which include things like what you're talking about. And that was published in May of 2019. It's on our website.
Right. And we had a question right here in the front, if our mic runner wants to come back. She's getting her exercise today.
Thanks. Hi, Joyce Frieden, MedPage Today. I wanted to ask Mr. Seidman to expand a little on what he said about providers possibly being held accountable for having those financial conversations with patients. What form do you see that taking, and have you talked to any providers that are willing to do this?
So this is sort of the next phase of this work on cost of care conversations that we've just embarked on with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We literally kicked it off 2 weeks ago. So we're still in the sort of process of identifying through an environmental landscape everything that exists that we might draw on. We think that there's sort of likely two kinds of things that we'll need to create. So one would be new actual measures, and these could be performance measures, quality improvement measures, things of that nature. The second would be tools or toolkits or resources that can be provided alongside that. We don't want to just sort of create a set of expectations around accountability without providing some guidance for how to get there.
Anand, as a physician, would you like to have the last word here on that?
I think, Josh is right. In medical school 20 plus years ago, we didn't really learn anything about sort of the cost of care, and I hope things have improved 2 decades later. But I think all of these conversations are important. They're all teachable moments. I think we can't shy away from having conversations about costs. I think we all need to learn more about this, and in our particular settings where we work, and whether it's a clinical setting or not, I think we need to have these conversations, because at the end of the day, we're here for our patients and our citizens, and this is important to them. So it's important that we're informed about these issues.
Well, please join me in thanking my wonderful panel, Anand, Reena, Josh.
Now, for a conversation produced by our underwriter, please welcome to the stage Kirsten Axelson, a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. She is joined by Alexander Hardy, the CEO of Genentech.
Good morning, Alexander, and good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for joining us this morning. So, tell me what's going on that's exciting at Genentech right now. What gets you motivated to go to work every day?
Well, it's a very, very exciting time right now in terms of science. I think you've probably heard a little bit of that today, but things like gene therapy, cell-based therapy, potential for curing devastating diseases. That's very, very exciting. From a Genentech standpoint, for the last 20 years, we've been pretty much synonymous with oncology. And we're very proud of the progress we've made or helped make in the field of oncology. Right now, we're building on our experience in oncology and moving into neuroscience in a very big way. I think people will know that we've had drugs for stroke. Just a few years ago, we launched a very, very important medicine for multiple sclerosis. But when we look at our near-term pipeline, there's just some really exciting drugs for neuroscience. These drugs have the potential to deal with devastating things like neurodegenerative diseases that rob us of who we are. And the science is very, very exciting. And we have 14 drugs in development for neuroscience. And just a few examples. We've got the first oral drug for spinal muscular atrophy. We're just in the filing process for that. We've got the first disease-modifying treatment for Huntington's disease. And then we've got the only drug in phase 3 development for autism spectrum disorder, which I think everybody understands is a very, very difficult disease which impacts a lot of people and, more importantly, their families and their communities.
So these are drugs that clearly have high unmet need, often taken by people who are very sick and in a very bad situation. What stops you from setting just an exorbitant price that these people could never afford?
Yeah, so we take pricing as a very, very serious topic. The last 9 drugs that we've launched, we've launched them at or below the current standard of care price, even though in most of those situations with the regulatory process, we've proven we're better than the standard of care. So, for example, I mentioned the drug in multiple sclerosis. We actually priced that at 25% less than the drug that we showed that we beat conclusively in the clinical studies. So pricing responsibility is something we take very, 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 very seriously. Now, we've got a very complex healthcare system in the US. There are cracks. So at the same time, we also have comprehensive support programs like the Genentech Patient Foundation that provides free drug for about 60,000 patients a year. So these are for patients that can't afford the medicines. They don't have insurance coverage, or their insurance carrier says they won't cover the drugs, or they're having difficulty affording the medicine.
Great. So earlier today, we talked about the legislative proposal that's moving forward into markup that would use international reference pricing for a specific set of drugs and Medicare. The CBO has said that would have an impact on the development of new drugs. Can you tell me, though, as a CEO, what decisions would you make differently about your investment in R&D or your commercialization if there were international price indexing in drugs in Medicare that didn't have a generic alternative?
Well, thanks for asking. And of course, that's the subject of today's session and why I'm here in Washington, because this is a very, very important time. We're an innovation pure play company. We don't have a biosimilar division or a generic division or a consumer division. We are an R&D company. We invest $11 billion a year in research and development. And, the sorts of work we do, as I hope has come across through the remarks I've already made, is we go after the really, really tough challenges. And the concern is, and I think it's really a significant concern we should all be aware of, is that legislation like H.R. 3, we believe, will significantly impact innovation. The Congressional Budget Office, I think, conservatively estimates that there will be an impact of maybe 15 less new medications if H.R. 3 happens. I think that's conservative. I think it's going to be much, much higher. The reality is that what is going to happen is that the really tough diseases, where you're taking the really big scientific bets, that's the first ones where the research is going to lessen. I personally was involved in our decision to go big in Alzheimer's. We've spent $2 billion in Alzheimer's. We have this much to show for it. But we continue to have drugs in research and in development in Alzheimer's. And that's because we believe that there will be a marketplace at the end of it. So I think it's those sorts of drugs which will be the ones which will suffer the first. And I'm confident that, unfortunately, the decisions will be that you'll go for the smaller, easier scientific bets rather than the big, tough diseases that we know as a society we need to solve.
But you do negotiate the price of drugs with governments in other countries. So why wouldn't you just want to do it in the U.S.? Why wouldn't we just take on that same system here?
Well, I think when you look at H.R. 3, you see that it's actually, it's very, very clear. It's not really negotiation. And this is our experience of working across the world. So there is quite a few people here who are, I don't mean in this room necessarily, although it would be interesting to poll the group, are flirting with this idea of international reference pricing. But that presumes that those countries do it right. They're very, very different systems with different priorities, different economies. And those prices, we believe, aren't the right prices. The US drives the innovation in our industry. And the US, by and large, has it right. Now, that's not saying that there aren't changes that need to happen. And that's the other thing that I would really want to communicate is, we've got to make sure we safeguard innovation, but at the same time, absolutely, there is a problem with out-of-pocket costs for drug costs. There is a problem with drug costs in the US. And as a company, we want to solve those issues. We think the solution is market-based reform, where we can make the market work much more efficiently to increase the competitive incentives at play, rather than involving the government, because we think the government involvement will have a dramatic impact on innovation. So I'm not here saying, we don't need to do anything, innovation's at threat. There is absolutely things that we can do to reduce out-of-pocket costs for patients, which is a really critical issue.
So since you mentioned that, if you were writing the next piece of legislation that would reform the market, reform how drugs were reimbursed, what would you do? What would you do when you put pen to paper?
Well, I think, just building on the topic of let's make the US market work really much more effectively. Right now, the system doesn't fully allow competitive forces to work. So one of the ideas that we're proposing on Capitol Hill, and I've talked to lots of senators and House, I've been to the White House as well, is the concept of market pricing model, which is basically, let's increase the level of competition on the private insurance side in Part B and allow Medicare to take advantage of those increased discounts. Now, for those of you that are sort of deep in the policy area, what we need to do is change the ASP calculation so that physician practices aren't put underwater, and we can really allow companies to contract more aggressively with insurance providers. That's one thing that I would do right away. At the same time, I would address the Part B, Part D out-of-pocket costs of patients in terms of the benefit design. I think that's absolutely critical. So you could take the savings in the first one, and you've got to really address that. Anything that we do has to flow through to the patients. That's where the issue is. I would also, look at topics like combination drug pricing. We have another proposal there. That's where oncology is moving, is to more and more doublets and triplets. And at the moment, with the US system, unfortunately, that means it's 1 + 1 = 2. If we had unique codes for combinations, which we're proposing, we would be prepared to lower our prices for those combinations. And this is a precursor of what you heard in the prior panel. This allows us to start to move towards indication-based pricing, value-based pricing models, and I think really start to allow competition to happen. And in many European countries, we can do this, but unfortunately in the US system, where prices are set on a per milligram basis, this is not possible. And this is not where the science is. The science is moving faster than our payment systems.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us this morning, and good luck bringing those innovations across the finish line to the patients who need them.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
At the Future of Medical Innovation, please welcome Dr. Sarah Naim, a partner at New Enterprise Associates, and Stephen Ezel, Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Back to lead the conversation is Susan Salney.
Thank you once again. Well, the life science sector, including pharmaceuticals, biotech, and medical devices, has long been an American success story. And part of our conversation today will be about how we keep it that way. But I was hoping we could start by you giving us some perspective on this sector's impact on the U.S. economy. It's difficult to overstate, right?
Well, you're right that the United States does lead the world in life sciences innovation. In fact, in the decade of the 2000s, U.S. headquartered enterprises introduced more new-to-the-world drugs than did enterprises from the next 5 nations combined. And over the past two decades, U.S. headquartered companies have introduced 42% of new-to-the-world drugs. But you know what? It was not always that way. In fact, in the latter half of the 1970s, European headquartered companies introduced twice as many new to the world drugs as American ones did, 149 to 66. So the reality is that for many years, the United States was a global also-ran in life sciences innovation. And what changed in the 1980s and 1990s was a concerted set of public policies that were intentionally designed to make America the global leader in life sciences innovation. Notably, those policies were dramatically increased federal investment in life sciences research, policies like the Bayh-Dole Act that facilitated the movement of technology and innovation from universities to the private sector, and a drug pricing system that allowed companies to capture a share of the profits from their innovative medicines to be reinvested in the future. And so what's the result? To your point today, we have an industry, the life sciences industry, that accounts for $675 billion of US GDP, that's 4% of our economy, employs 1.2 million workers directly, 3.5 million workers indirectly for almost 5 million workers, 22% of whom work in actual research, and an industry that supports $90 billion in exports. So it is a dramatic American success story, but it's the result of intentional policies, which we have to remember we must keep in place if we wish the industry to thrive into the future.
Yeah, and I'm an investor, so I work at a venture capital firm called New Enterprise Associates, actually headquartered in Chevy Chase as well as Menlo Park on the West Coast. And I've been at NEA for almost 11 years. And so what struck me is over that time, what a dramatic acceleration we've actually had in innovation in life sciences. And you can measure that in a few different ways. The number of drugs that have been approved, 2018 was a record number of drug approvals, 59 drugs were approved. The vast amount of capital that's been going into the life sciences, both in terms of private capital and public capital. So the IPO market opened for biopharma companies in 2013. And the amount of capital, the number of companies that have gone public over that period of time since 2013 has exceeded the entire history of the biopharma industry prior to that. And then you can also look at what's been fueling both of that excitement in terms of the public market. Why are people interested in investing in biopharma? It has a lot to do with these massive platforms that have been developed. Things like gene editing and gene therapy, immuno-oncology, which have made these really amazing inroads into treating cancers where previously we had very low response rates. Survival rates have gone up. So that's really the ultimate indicator we're looking for, and we've already started to see that in terms of improved response rates, improved survival rates in cancer, and many diseases that previously we had no drugs for that now there are drugs for. So I think it's really an exciting time in terms of the scientific innovation where we've really finally reached the genomic age, and we can get into that more later as well.
It's also important to note that this is an industry in the United States, but also across the world, that invest more in research and innovation than any other sector of the economy. In fact, in 2016, US life sciences companies plowed 44% of their value added back into research. It is the world's most R&D intensive industry, and US companies actually invest twice as much in business R&D expenses than European ones do. So it's an industry that our nation should be proud of.
Oh, interesting. And other nations, though, China and India among them, are investing more heavily now in research and development. Is the U.S. at risk of losing its status as biomedical leader of the world?
I could
go ahead. I'll go next.
All right. In my view, it's not a competition. It's really about the U.S. has been a global leader. And we do have an economy that's set up and a healthcare system that's set up that makes innovation possible. So it's important that we be out there as leaders doing the science, that's the early stage science, much of which is conducted by the NIH, but also at academic institutions and also at small companies, such as some of the ones that I invest in, where we may be starting with just an idea. There's not even any chemical matter against a target, but it's an important, interesting class. So we need to continue to invest in basic science and also R&D, clinical trials, becoming more efficient, being more creative, thinking about the right patient populations to test, how to look at biomarkers so that we can make sure that we're getting engagement with the target by a drug early in clinical trials. So all of those things are important, and those things are happening across the world. And in many cases, it's faster for our companies to start their clinical trial development in other countries. Australia, for instance, has a more efficient path. It can cut a year off of our first-in-man trials in terms of starting there, but ultimately the FDA will want to see the drug tested in, at least some U.S. patients. So I think it's not a competition in my view. I think there's a lot we need to stay out in terms of the leadership, especially because we actually have the economy and system set up to bring drugs to market and fuel the innovation. But a lot of the science as well as clinical research is accelerating elsewhere as well. And ultimately, I think it's in general a good thing.
I guess my perspective on that question is that success is never permanent and failure is never final. Leadership of the United States in the life sciences industry is not assured unless we tend to it. And that goes for all branches of innovation. I think one major concern the United States should have is that if we look at public investment in R&D, our federal government would have to invest $60 billion more per year as a share of GDP to get back to where we were in 1983.
Did you say 60 billion?
60 billion more. If you look at the life sciences sector on a share of GDP basis, since 2003, NIH funding as a share of GDP has declined by about 12%. And you see that showing up in some factors. For instance, I understand that the average age of first R01 NIH grant has increased to 42 years today from 34 in the 1980s. Success rates have declined down to the 20% range. And so if you're a bright young researcher trying to get an NIH grant, but there's not funding for it, then you're going to look at alternative opportunities in places like Singapore or China, and that will enable international competitors to also get a leg up. China is a serious competitor. They will invest $300 billion in life sciences innovation as part of their Made in China 2025 strategy. I understand they have as much gene sequencing capacity at one institute in Beijing, kind of 2/3 of global capacity. Certainly I agree with you that we need global science to create global cures, but other countries wish to wrest competitive leadership in this industry from the United States, and they could do so if we're not careful.
And I think it's also it's important that science be shared freely across different regions. That part has not been that challenging. I think in some ways the more challenging part is how to rein in scientific experimentation when there are ethical concerns, as we saw with gene editing and the two human embryos that were edited by this Chinese researcher in the last year. It was, a huge debacle, and the whole scientific community, medical community, sort of, raised their hands and said, "How did this happen?" Numerous people knew that he was in the process of doing this, but didn't feel empowered or perhaps responsible to try to stop it. And so there are a lot of quandaries as scientific innovation continues to accelerate, especially around the things such as gene editing and the genome and other ethical quandaries we have, such as when you have a one-time potentially curative treatment, how do you have a competing treatment for that if you're saving the lives of infants who otherwise would die? How do you test some improved therapy for that or come up with a competitive therapy for things like competitive pricing? So I think there are a lot of quandaries that come up, and we're just at the beginning of that.
What area of the life science sector do you think is ripe for disruption right now? In other words, what transformative technology is just around the corner that's going to change our lives for the better?
So I think that the innovations that have taken place in the past, say, 5 to 10 years and are continuing to accelerate and showing promise are around two big areas. The first would be these big scientific platforms I mentioned. So gene therapy has really come of age. We now have approved gene therapies manufacturing in place. It involves delivering a defective or missing gene, generally within a viral plasmid, to a patient, and can constitute a one-time cure if that's the hope. We'll see, the data continues to evolve. Then there are related therapies such as mRNA therapy, which is delivering the RNA. So DNA gets transcribed into, DNA goes to RNA, which goes to protein. So delivering RNA is a safer and potentially broader reaching way of delivering genetic material, but it isn't a one-time cure because you have to give it chronically, but it could be much more broadly applicable. And then there's gene editing, which is probably the most extraordinary of all, where you're actually not just adding a gene or putting a gene in through a capsid, but editing the genome, taking out a gene, adding a gene, changing a gene. Right now, that's really ex vivo applications where you take the cells out, edit them, and put them back into the patient, which is obviously safer. But ultimately, the hope is that there will be in vivo applications where I think we do have to be more careful about it, particularly any germline mutations, trying to edit those where it could be passed on to future generations. So that's one big area, and why we've seen a lot of this capital coming in from the public market as well as the private market. And another big area I would highlight is immuno-oncology. So it's harnessing the body's immune system to fight cancer. The leading class of drugs in this space, which are called PD-1 or PD-L1 inhibitors, will generate something like $30 to $40 billion per year at peak. Those are the estimates right now. And they've become a standard of care in first-line, second-line settings across many different diseases. And the hope is that you're not just pushing out survival by a few months or a year, or maybe if you're lucky, but actually lifting the curve. So not just shifting the curve over, but lifting it where you're delivering real long-lived responses, potentially cures to patients. Right now, it's not. The response rates need to continue to be higher. We're continuing to look at different combinations of different immunotherapies and working on trying to manage the toxicities of those. And then there's cell therapy, which is another way of delivering immunotherapy, which is perhaps a little less. We still need to work through the logistics of that, where again you're taking cells out of a patient's body, editing them so that they can attack and more readily recognize particular antigens and on the surface of a cancer cell and go out and find and destroy that cancer cell. So those are the big areas where I think there's a lot of promise, but still, honestly, a lot of risk as to whether or not they actually play through that. There does seem to feel a little bit like there's a bubble, a little bit of, when does the music stop? Because the valuations have gotten quite high, and the private and public markets and companies have been going public at earlier and earlier stages. Something like nearly half of the 2018 IPOs were preclinical or phase 1. So.
Stephen, what do you think about areas ripe for disruption?
Well, that was pretty comprehensive. So maybe just add 2 other points to it. I mean, I think these platform technologies we have today are going to assist in all facets of life sciences and healthcare delivery, from early stage detection of diseases to the ability to screen for and research and develop new drugs. The director of DARPA came into our think tank a couple weeks back and gave a presentation on some of the healthcare technologies they were working on. And one example she gave was of a smartwatch that essentially monitors your sweat, your secretions over time, so it establishes a lifetime baseline and gives the ability to immediately detect variations that could be an early indicator of cancer or other types of diseases.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Very sophisticated. Artificial intelligence is going to completely transform the life sciences space. IBM has Watson, which is their AI tool. And as I understand, when they deployed the artificial learning to the challenge of ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, and looking at the way certain mRNA interact with proteins and genes in the body, essentially that IBM Watson was able to help ALS researchers identify as many biomarkers or potential early stage indicators for ALS in 1 year than researchers had been able to achieve in the prior 10 years. So step changes in the ability to identify how proteins and genes interact in the body. One other point there is going to be on medical diagnosis. A recent study out of the UK pitted artificial intelligence versus radiologists on the ability to accurately detect melanoma. And the AI machine was right 93% of the time, and the doctors 87% of the time. But when they worked together, collaboratively, it was 97% success rate. So we'll get
That's amazing.
Human-machine collaboration to improve health outcomes.
Well, we heard from the FDA earlier. I'm curious to know what your view is on the role of government in innovation and medical breakthroughs.
So I think, as Stephen mentioned, a lot of it starts with the basic science and having government research, government funding through the NIH. That's really important. And there is somewhat of a perception that actual drug development happens through the NIH and very little of that is actually the NIH, but the basic science, really early stage science, happens there. We've also seen some really important legislation that's come through in the past 20 years. So, for instance, the Orphan Drug Act, where there are these rare diseases where there were no therapies available for them, and many times devastating, fatal diseases, and in many cases, those are drugs that could be repurposed for those indications, but they're without any type of patent life, you wouldn't be able to actually commercialize or fund development for those drugs. So the Orphan Drug Act allowed for 7 years of exclusivity. There's something similar in Europe that allows for 10 years of exclusivity after it's approved if you can get orphan designation for that drug. So another drug that comes through that's of the same class, or that's that same molecule, has to show better safety, better efficacy, or some major improvement in terms of, say, patient convenience. So that allowed for there to be a real proliferation of drug development around these rare diseases, where again you see in many cases devastating effects and could be major costs to the healthcare, to the economy as well.
Stephen, role of government?
Well, I would certainly emphasize the complementarity between public and private sector investment in life sciences research. Public investment, creates a platform of basic science, understanding of disease pathways, of biomarkers, that creates a platform which the private sector can take and build upon and do the advanced applied and translational clinical trial work to bring safe and effective drugs to market. And research estimates that for every $1 of investment the public sector makes, the private sector is making an additional $100 of investment to bring an innovative new drug to market. So that's a key point. Another, I think, is the process we have to ensure safe and effective drugs are brought to market. And if you look at the 1980s, it took on average 36 months for the FDA to make a decision on the clinical safety and efficacy of a drug. We put in place something called the PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which created mechanisms to bring public and private sector together to give the FDA the resources it needed to make more effective determinations. And now we see that on average, the FDA is making a approval 3 months faster than in Europe, much faster than in Canada. We have put in place accelerated pathways for breakthrough drugs. And so we've been very effective at creating pathways which innovative breakthrough drugs can get to our patients more quickly than anywhere else in the world.
Well, speaking of Canada, countries like the UK and Canada allow the government to negotiate drug prices. Good or bad idea?
Well, one thing we would contend we should not do is import the drug pricing systems of Canada or European countries in general. The reality is that one of the reasons the U.S. clearly leads the world in life sciences innovation is because our companies have been able to recoup revenues from their investments in prior generations of innovation so they can invest in the next. It takes, on average, $2.6 billion to bring a new biologic drug to market in 12 to 14 years. This process is not inexpensive. We got to think about how we bring the capital to the table to make that happen. And when you look at estimates from Europe or Canada, there is very clearly drug lags in terms of availability of access to innovative medicines like cancer therapies. One study found a 15-month lag availability of cancer medicines between the United States and other countries in the reference price index. The reality is that other countries are not paying their fair share for life sciences innovation. They should be paying more. One indicative fact of that, by the way, is we have $90 billion of exports of U.S. life sciences drugs per year, but we actually have a trade deficit of about $56 billion. And the reason why is we are paying fair market price for other countries' innovations, but they're not paying that much for ours.
And I agree. I think that as someone who invests in life sciences, we often start with a model. Well, first we say, is this a drug? Is this an indication, a disease where there's unmet need? How severe is it? What's available? What's the standard of care? What's the innovation? And how is there a new mechanism of action? Something that can be disease modifying for this disease? Some exciting innovation. But then we also do a model, an economic model where often it's relatively simple. What are the potential peak sales probability? Adjust those. So what's the probability of success of going through phase 1, phase 2, depending on what stage the molecule's at when we're looking at a particular investment opportunity. And then we discount that back to when we think the exit data. So a simple model, but it all rests on what we think the probability adjusted sales are at a particular exit date. So Oftentimes our models are driven primarily by the US market. We start with the US market. Sometimes we don't really put in the EU. Usually we don't even think about Asia or put those in. We need to be able to justify an investment, usually off of the US market, sometimes off of US and EU market. But if you take out the US market, you make it equal to the EU market, many of those would just not be investable opportunities anymore. So the drug costs have been steady at about 12% of our overall healthcare system cost since the 70s, and they've remained at that. And the drugs go generic, so we may talk about this a little more in a minute, but drugs go generic after, say, 10 to 15 years, and the higher branded prices that were paid up until that point, once they go generic, society has this benefit of drugs that have dropped, in some cases by 95% of the original cost. So that in of itself is a mechanism to allow society to recoup an amazing, almost infinite benefit from these drugs over time. And the only exception perhaps would be an antibiotic where you have resistance that occurs and you need to keep coming up with new antibiotics. But a statin like Lipitor that dropped by 95% when it went generic has contributed to 50% drop in deaths from MI and stroke, and it's a generic drug now. So we have to think about not just the current drug pricing, the current costs. I think there's thinking about drug pricing, which is 12% of the total healthcare costs. It's stayed the same. I think what's changed has been greater burden on patients and on consumers for their healthcare costs in general and for drug costs in particular. So I think that's where we need to think about cost sharing, and in some cases is it actually counterproductive for society as a whole, where only 50% of prescriptions are filled. In many cases, companies do have support for indigent patients or uninsured patients, but patients may not always know that, and doctors may not mention it, and so they oftentimes don't get their therapies, which can postpone or prevent much more costly interventions that may have to occur later, where you don't have this dramatic drop in price for an MRI or an angioplasty to unclog someone's coronary arteries, for instance.
Just want to remind the audience that we're going to come for a quick question in just a moment. But Stephen, I think you had something to add on that.
So the prior speaker from Genentech, I'm sure, talked about Avastin and Herceptin, their breakthrough drugs for lung and breast cancer, respectively. The reality is that in July 24, over the summer, the FDA approved a biosimilar, a generic competitor for those drugs. So essentially, we have a generic available drug for breast and lung cancer, a set of diseases that we had no solutions to at all 25 years ago. And I'd like to offer a quote from Jack Scannell, who is a senior fellow from Oxford University's Center for the Advancement of Sustainable Medical Innovation. As Scannell wrote, "I would guess that one can buy today at rock-bottom generic prices a set of small molecule drugs that has greater medical utility than the entire set available to anyone, anywhere, at any price in the year 1995. Nearly all of that generic medicine chest was created by firms who invested in R&D to win future profits, which they tried hard to maximize. It was short-term financial gain, building a long-term common good. But it's that process that enables us to envision a future in the year 2040 where we may have a drug for Alzheimer's or a form of cancer available at rock-bottom prices that is not available today."
Do we have one quick question ready? Yes, right there.
Good morning. My name is Veronica Vella, and I'm from George Washington University. So I have a question about health equity with respect to the development of drugs. So it's well known that, a lot of the therapies that are available today in terms of the clinical trials that are used, they're used on a subset of the population. Women, for example, were often excluded for a lot of clinical trials, and drugs affect women's bodies differently, as well as other, racial and ethnic groups. And I was wondering if you guys could talk about clinical trial research and how that has moved, if it is moving to create, drugs that are responsive to different types of people today.
So I think it's a huge issue as a woman, and having looked at some of the clinical trials from, say, the 70s, 80s, 90s, even aughts, where may not have any women or almost all, say, Caucasians, and it gets to some important issues. And it also gets to the issue of just patient stratification and personalized medicine in general. So while I think the industry has done an okay job at increasing the diversity of patients in clinical trials, we still have a long way to go. And And what we see more often now is, like I mentioned, Australia. We may start testing a drug in a population that's actually maybe genetically similar to the United States, but only to say one ethnic group or somewhat bias in terms of the ethnic group, and that's in order for speed and efficiency. And then in later stage trials, that's where I think you really need to make sure you're getting as much ethnic diversity as possible, and that's where the bigger safety signals will be seen because you're testing on many, many more patients. But also patient stratification in personalized medicine, a lot of that is saying, okay, what are the mutations? How do we define this population? How do we split it into subpopulations? And some of them may be responsive to this drug, and some of them may not be. But that improves the efficiency of clinical trials. It improves overall costs of getting a drug to market, and it reduces the number of patients who will get a drug that's not beneficial for them. So that's been one of the big innovations. Things like biomarkers to see if there's if there's drug engagement. Genetic analysis to say, do you have a particular mutation, and just being able to have creative trial design as well to say, okay, well, the patient is responding, then we will build out expansion cohorts just in those subsets of patients or those tumor types where there's responsiveness, or even look at something like a particular genetic mutation across many different histologies, which is a new innovation as opposed to just saying we're going to test this in all breast cancer patients or all lung cancer patients. But it's a really important point.
Do you have a quick final thought on that?
I would just add the thought that one reason that's very important is when we talk about the cost of medicines, and that's vitally important, and to ensure that patients aren't having to come out of pocket too much. But I think one thing we also need to focus on, and policy can help play an important role, is how we increase overall R&D efficiency. So we bring down the cost of how difficult it is to innovate new medicines. And so smarter clinical trial design, weeding out the failures in phase 1 and 2 of clinical trials before we get to phase 3 can bring down some of these overall systemic cost of innovation. Also, government has an important role to play here with like Manufacturing USA institutes. We have one called BioFab USA. There's a role to play in working with the private sector to develop new processes for drug discovery and drug manufacturing. And if we can bring down the overall cost of innovating the drugs, then we'll be in a much better place across the entire healthcare innovation ecosystem.
Well, I think we have to end on that note. Stephen, Sarah, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Sarah, Steve, and Susan for that conversation from the quest for bipartisanship on drug pricing to balancing innovation and cost and the promise of medical breakthroughs. We covered rich and wide-ranging territory, and these are issues we'll continue to explore. I'd like to once again thank Pharma for making this Atlantic series possible. Mostly, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I know how valuable your time is, and we're really grateful that you spent so much with us. Do me one last favor before you leave or right after you leave. There are surveys on your chairs or you'll get an email from me. If you can fill it out, we really rely on your feedback to do what we do better and better every time. Have a wonderful day. See you again soon.